Доброго дня, наші учасники.
Good morning, good afternoon, dear participants. And we see that all of our participants are joining. So let's wait for a couple of minutes so that hundreds of people from the region of Southeastern Europe and Central Asia joined us. We have the interpretation function, so please, in the bottom of your Zoom screen, choose the language channel that is convenient for you. We are interpreting into English, Bosnian, Albanian, Georgian, and Russian. And that is why you can choose any channel convenient. I am Victoria Kalyniuk. I am coordinator of the REACT system implemented within the regional project of the Global Fund. By the Alliance for Public Health, we document violation of human rights and cases of discrimination among representatives of vulnerable group in the context of HIV response and in the framework of 16 days of activism against violence against girls and women. We have organized 3 webinars. We have a star speaker from Ukraine, and a lot of colleagues from Ukraine decided to join when they discovered who the speaker is going to be. Marta has immense experience and she will speak about herself. So while we are waiting for the participants to join, a couple of more technical aspects. So we had one webinar already, and I will send the link to the recording in the chat box, and I will send the link to the page where we are going to publish. Unfortunately, because of shutdown-related problems, it is hard for us to quickly publish this proceedings, this material. So sorry for that delay, but we will definitely publish everything on the webpage of 16 Days Against Violence campaign webpage. You will have time to look through the recording and to have the final testing. We will announce the final testing opening after the 3rd webinar, and you will have 3 weeks to complete it. 2 weeks. Sorry, so you will be in the position to complete the test till the end of the year, and then you will receive your named certificates. And we're still waiting. If you have questions, you can ask them in the chat. You can welcome your colleagues in the chat. If you have questions, any questions about what Marta is going to present, please use Q&A insert. So you can ask those questions confidentially or publicly, and we will try to address all of your questions. So let's wait for 1 more minute. And then we will be in the position to start. So I believe that we can start. We are recording the webinar, so if somebody joins later, they will be in the position to go back to the recording. And now, Marta, I pass the floor to you. And I invite the audience to follow, and I will keep an eye on Q&A to timely address those questions. So please use Q&A button to ask questions to Marta. And please unmute yourself. Thank you. Thank you, Victoria, and welcome to all the participants. Thank you for your invitation. Thank you for your attention to this very important theme, I believe. And now let me start screen sharing.
І тут у нас буде так, почекайте, і, власне, тут є коротко про те,
And here,
хто я є.
this is a brief description of my background. I work at an NGO. This is Women's Perspective Center. This is the organization that for more than 25 years now has been operating in Ukraine. We are located in the city of Lviv, and we keep operating, working in Lviv. Lviv now is one of the largest hubs for internally displaced people. For example, in our organization, we had one shelter, but now we have 7. We provide comprehensive sets of services, both at the front line directly, and we also work with those people who help our target groups, which are mostly women in crisis, mostly women who survive domestic and gender-based violence. I provide psychotherapeutic services within our organization, and my key instruments are EMDR, CBT, and scheme-based therapy. And I also work a lot with groups, including groups of experts, specialists, psychotherapists, police, judges, and other target groups. And the main idea, objective, is to make sure that the society and the space where the survivor is, were sensitive to his or her suffering. And this is our second meeting today. Last time on Monday, we tried to discuss in more detail the core models that we need to take into account when we work with cases of violence, in particular domestic violence and GBV. And today we are going to speak about domestic and gender-based violence from the perspective of the perpetrator. We are going to focus on those models, on those impacts that make someone, motivate someone to go violent. On Monday, we started discussing a little bit one of those models, and now we're going to go back to it. So I guess we can start now, right? Victoria, shall we proceed with the theoretical part? Yes, we can start. Great. Now, I think, I fantasize that everyone here are aware of the 4 forms of violence. They are stipulated in the Ukrainian legislation, but also in a lot of international documents, including the Istanbul Convention, and that is physical, psychological, financial, and sexual violence. These are 4 forms of violence that we identify and that we separate in order to better understand what's going on. And actually, the model that we started discussing during the previous webinar, that is the Minnesota Wheel of Violence model based on power and control. We refer to it as the power and control wheel or Minnesota model of the wheel of violence. Last Monday, I told you a little bit about the idea, the concept of the Minnesota model, and let me recap. So it helps to focus the attention of those people who apply this model to the fact that at the beginning of any violent relationship, any violence, psychological violence happens. So everything starts with psychological violence. And if this psychological violence is effective, efficient, then no physical violence needs to be used. Because what is desired, power and control, can be achieved with psychological violence. And this aspect makes it possible for us to understand that when we have contact, when we are in contact with someone who already has signs of physical violence, It means that most probably this individual for quite a long time has been suffering psychological violence. So even some minor physical damage, harm needs to be treated very seriously because it means that psychological violence has been lasting for a while. Minnesota model focuses on the perpetrator's behavior because actually this model is focused on the strategies of the perpetrator's behavior. In the middle, in the core of this model, there is this need for power and control. According to the Minnesota model, an individual starts exerting violence under the impact of this core motivation, core drive. And this is need for power and control over the life of another person. That's what you are going to do. You are going to act as I tell you to act. You are going to be employed. You are not going to be employed. You must wear the clothes that I want you to wear. You are going to do your lessons when I tell you to do homework when I tell you to do that. So I know better what you must do. And this dynamics where I try to stipulate my domination, and I try to implement that. Now we are going to speak about the core strategies that are applied by the perpetrator so that this power and control were introduced or forced on someone. First of all, this is coercion and threats, intimidation as well. So this is where an individual creates the atmosphere where the survivor always needs to look back or to anticipate that he or she is going to receive some instructions or orders, like do this or that, and that is very directive, no alternatives. I know better. Unless you do this way, you are going to suffer, you are going to feel pain or whatever. So they tell one directly, unless you do this or that, unless you obey, you are going to suffer consequences. And quite often these consequences are named. For example, this may be physical threats. So the perpetrator might describe what's going to happen, how he's going to annihilate or attack the other. So those could be quite frightening prospects, even threats of homicide. And these threats are usually perceived as something serious enough, because then there are grounds to be afraid that these threats will be implemented, executed. And the perpetrator may commit violence. For example, now I work with a client and she says that the perpetrator calls her from unknown phone numbers, so she doesn't know those numbers. She answers the call and he tells her, you are going to be buried at that cemetery, and he explains the details of that. And that's, of course, very stressful for the survivor. This kind of threats quite often help the perpetrator to achieve the goal, the power and control goal. Then isolation. On Friday, we are going to speak more about isolation. This is one of key strategies where the perpetrator kind of cuts any contacts of the survivor with the social support group. Quite often, the perpetrator may break her cell phone for her not to be able to contact anyone. And if the survivor doesn't keep her contact information on cloud storage, then they just lose it. Or the perpetrator may prohibit any contact with the parents, with the sister or friends. So isolation, that's one of key strategies that we observe and that we probe for, check for. I always ask survivors, what kind of people do you have around? Who can give you support? With whom can you share your pain and the problems that you encounter? Who can give you a hand? So isolation, it is also key. That's a key strategy to establish power and control, where the survivor is isolated, left alone, and then she has no access to those resources. She has no one to discuss the situation with, to talk to. And that's why the recommendations of the Istanbul Convention are very important. And this is about establishing hotlines and some counseling services. So if you work at this kind of frameworks or organizations, it is so important that you are just with the person who wants to break free from that isolation, because often these people are very lonely. Next strategy would be belittling, denying, accusing the survivor, where the perpetrator says, I have done nothing much. Your skin is so tender, sensitive that I just hold your hand and now you have bruises. This is not a problem. And then they often they use this strategy when they communicate with law enforcers. We could see this trends based on Eleanor Walker wheel that we discussed last time. But here, these strategies, they are indicated as a separate section. Then manipulating with children. This is close to isolation, and this is also one of key strategies to establish power and control over the survivor, where the perpetrator says, you can go wherever you wish, but the kid stays with me. Then the woman doesn't go anywhere. We had a case where the child needed certain medical healthcare asthma related interventions, and the man was very much against those interventions, and that put the child's life at risk. Without healthcare services, the child would not survive. So then the woman has to stay next to the child and next to the perpetrator. Various kinds of manipulations with children may apply even after separation, where the perpetrator lost power and control. They separated, they divorced, the woman goes to another city to live there, and there he might appoint the time to see the children, to meet the children, and in this way he starts manipulating with children.
And there are cases when perpetrator gifted a toy to a child with a hidden microphone or a mobile phone, but every evening then calls and asks the child to film what's going on. So we are speaking here about the fact that for him, it is important. Well, what's important is not to contact the child, but to restore the control he used to have and lost because of the separation. And here is this example, very illustrative example of manipulation with children, when the perpetrator asked the court and the Council of Supervisors to appoint a time and actually place for meetings in the apartment of the survivor. And she said, okay, come, I'll take the kids out, you take them for a walk, and then return them to me. But that was not enough for him. He wanted to have meetings inside the apartment, and she did not want to let him in to her personal space. So we need to check what's going on with the kids, and if we deal with the situation when there are children, it is very important to ask what's happening to the kids. That is, what is their status? What is their position, so to say? Because very often, well, we spoke about the kids last time a little bit, when the children may be the decisive factor for taking survivor from the learned helplessness syndrome. Here we need to understand also that very often, until certain age, children blame themselves. They're very egocentric at this time, and they perceive the world through the prism of themselves being in its center and everything happening because of them. Like the rain is falling because I wanted something, for example, or the father beats the mother because I did something wrong. So everything for them happens because of them. And when the child sees violence, they very often take responsibility. So they blame themselves. And I can mention here a study conducted in Italy quite long ago. The Italian researchers proved that the child observing violence can be traumatized much more than the child beaten by one of the parents while being helped by another parent. So when such a child just observes this violence, she or he experiences this metaphoric feeling of like losing both parents. So it's like an orphan, basically. The child understands that they are not needed to either of the parents. And Istanbul Convention actually takes it into account by recommending to the parties of the convention, the countries of the convention, to consider the witnessing child as a victim actually of domestic violence, and that's the right approach. So manipulation with children in these strategies of establishing power and control is one of the key points. Then, in my opinion, there is the most crucial, I don't know, strategy or maybe root of this violent behavior of men against women is gender aspects, gender-based roots. And when we start sort of unpacking this strategy, we need to remind ourselves that unfortunately we live in a patriarchy cultures, in patriarchal countries where violence is legitimized and is like given to the man as their right since the beginning of their socialization. So as soon as a boy is born, he gets delegated with that violence. Parents recommend him to fight back, to be strong, to not give up his toy when someone is trying to take it from him, be active, make decisions. And this child, through the social signals of the relatives of the close circle, understands that that's a approved behavior, yes, positive behavior. On the other hand, we have similar signals to girls, but with a different sort of polarity. We genderize a girl to make her be oriented to meet the needs of other people, to be empathic, to be a servant. The girls are genderized or socialized in a way that is oriented on establishing relationships, on getting married, on meeting the needs of the family, following the needs of the husband, and the husband is then genderized to be, or a man just is genderized to be a decision maker and someone capable of applying violence. And using this man's privilege, men very often establish the power and control in the family. When we hear the stories about them saying, only because I'm a man, you'll do what I say. In my family, the woman will not work. In my family, the woman cannot speak like this. So these are the things deeply rooted in the culture, transcendent things. And when we start delving deeper into this topic, we see a lot of it. And these are the roots of the violence. This is the source of the violent behaviors. And when we speak about programs for perpetrators, when we start looking into those gender roots, we make perpetrators understand how exactly they become perpetrators, how the society made them to be like that, and delegated these powers to them to be violent, to exercise control or power over other people. The next strategy is quite common now, and it is very notable now in Ukraine, for example. When the COVID epidemic started here, when a lot of people lost their jobs, that's economic-based violence. And we even saw this trend when the survivors who already got removed, they lived separately. When they lost a job during COVID, they had to return to the place of the perpetrator because they, well, for example, had a share in the ownership of that apartment and had no other place to live. And we conducted a survey of our former clients then, and we encountered a big increase in violence because of the economic violence, because people told us that a very strong pressing started about money spent, about earning money, and that led to arguments about loans and so on. And quite often that was against the interest of the family or the interest of the survivor of the violence, but instead had clear, distinct signs of economic violence. And we see economic violence especially among the vulnerable populations. We see, for example, that if a woman has additional vulnerabilities, quite often she has a lot of debts, and she has some loans taken. Quite often she's exploited, and she does the work she doesn't want to do. So domestic violence and the economic exploitation are interrelated very much, because quite often such women encounter physical violence, and they have bruises, and that's why the employers see that, and they are not really welcoming to take them to employ them. Quite often these women have health problems, and using these terms, such employers take such people to illegal jobs, very low paid jobs, and quite often the perpetrators join this public violence, forcing the woman to earn in money, and the perpetrator also limits. Another aspect of this economic violence is that the perpetrator limits her economic activity. He says, you don't have to have a job, you don't have a work, you don't need work, you need to take care of the family, I will earn the money. Even though she wants to have a job, even if she tells him that she wants to get employed. So these main strategies of psychological violence actually help the perpetrator to establish power and control. But when it doesn't work, or it works not the way the perpetrator wants, the perpetrator starts using physical violence, and that's like the external part of this wheel. It supports all of those areas of psychological violence and keeps them as one whole thing. So it supports and strengthens, effectivizes psychological violence, and the threat of physical violence forces the survivors to obedience if there is a physical violence already. So that's one of the key models. And why colleagues from Minnesota said that unlike the model of linear Walker, they suggest this particular model of the wheel of violence is because the Minnesota model is focused on the behavioral strategies of the perpetrator. It doesn't take into account, absolutely, it doesn't take into account the behaviors of the survivor of the violence. And we will speak more about that further, but that's a key aspect which we need to keep in mind. The violence takes place not because the survivor does something wrong or fails to do something or feels something or looks some way. The violence takes place only because the perpetrator wants to establish his power and control. The only reason of the violence is in the behavior of the perpetrator. It's up to him or her to decide whether to commit violence. And if we look at the similarities in relations between an adult and a child, you can see it clearly. No way, well, however the child behaves, it's only my decision to do something because I have this power and control. If I, as a perpetrator, does not like something in the behavior or in the looks or in any representation of the person I live with, I need to make a decision to do something about my desire to establish power and control. It's only me who can do this. And I make a decision about whether to be violent against this person. So this thing, you remember we spoke about phases of the violence on linear Walker's model. That's my decisions, my conscious actions, my decision to make violence, to commit violence. And quite often I hear the stories, for example, that the police officer said that he doesn't beat you very much, I would have beaten you even more. And things happening in your home, yes, they're bad, you don't clean it, and that's a violation of the human rights that are, well, allowed. And if communication is wrong or there is lack of cleaning or something else, I can step aside and say, let us live separately, or let us resolve this in some other way, this problem we have. So, on the side of the perpetrator, there is a decision to either commit violence or not. No matter how the survivor behaves, the decision is up to the perpetrator. And quite often there are comments about, I don't remember what I did, I was drunk, or I did not fully control myself. And here the answer is quite simple. If you know that psychoactive substances work for you this way so that you stop having good contact with the reality and you don't understand what you are doing, then you should stop taking psychoactive substances. You should control yourself. So there are situations when the person failed to control their behaviors, and such conditions are so-called affective conditions where, well, they are determined by a special commission of experts who can see whether this person actually did not control themselves or did. And if I sometimes see a perpetrator who says something like, oh, I was drunk and I did not control myself, and I ask him, so when you were drunk, did you fight some other people? No, never. I just drank a little bit at work. And I asked him, while going home, did you meet any people? Yeah. Did you attack them? Did you do something? No, no, nothing. I did nothing.
That means that they control their behavior, but when they come home and cross the threshold, this control is lost. And violence is committed against some particular individuals, particular members of the family. And this is one of the key surveys that I would like to discuss. This is the Dobash's survey, and it is what they did in a prison, male prison, and they surveyed men who had killed their partners or wives. One of those wives worked as a psychotherapist in a prison, and she started observing some specific features for those men who had killed their partners. And there were actually various criminals, some who robbed some facilities or killed someone in traffic. But she decided to look for some common features, attributes that would be specific for all the perpetrators, those who murdered their wives or partners. And she started exploring this issue. Her husband, sociologist, helped her, and now they have published quite a lot of important papers, and they're exploring this theme further. For example, we bought their book in English with detailed description of the trials, of the surveys that they did. So what they could see, what they observed, they wished to reject or to prove certain myths or stereotypes that back then applied to perpetrators. Namely, for example, they tested, they checked the impact of childhood history on the further development of a man as a perpetrator. Well, I believe that you also hear this statements or comments about that if a child was a witness of domestic violence at home, when they grow up, this child will definitely continue this tradition of violence. And we even have this formula that violence gives rise to violence. If you hit your child, the child is going to hit their spouses or their children. And this is the risk factor, definitely. And this is an enabler that may really contribute to the violent behavior of the child, but this is not a mandatory precondition, according to Dobash researchers. So they prove that not necessarily all the perpetrators who are violent now in childhood had suffered significant physical violence. You can see that 11% of those murderers were witnesses of their father attacking the mother. 17% lived with guardians or relatives. This is where they tested the hypothesis about full or families or separated parents, then whether they grew up in shelters or not. They explored all of these aspects, and we can see that 29% of those children had experience of violence in childhood. But most of the perpetrators who were imprisoned, they actually did not have this childhood background of violence. Then they also explored types of violence. What kind of violence was applied against that child in childhood against that person? Physical violence, that's only, let's see, 20%. 5% sexual violence. 75% were not subject to any kind of violence. Even though there was this idea or assumption that the hypothesis of that all the perpetrators, especially violent perpetrators, that they had suffered sexual abuse in childhood. And this research says that's not true. men who had killed their wives, most of them were not children abused in childhood, sexual abuse in particular. For behavior at school, it is 50 to 50. So actually, the survey, it covered the entire life cycle of the murderer. They also analyzed social contacts, experience at work, certain background of antisocial behavior. So at school, you see it as 50 to 50. Some were very good, socially accepted children, and now nobody could guess that they would spend most of their life in prison for murderers. Then psychoactive substances, abuse of psychoactive substances. Here you can see that, oh, it shifted a little bit. You can see that 20% of those men did drink alcohol, because the hypothesis was that if children, teenagers younger than 14 consumed alcohol, well, that is the period when impulse control is developed and is biologically formed. So if they were already abusing psychoactive substances, that would imply that when they grow up, their impulse control would be weaker, would fail. And that is why they try to explore what happened to them in the sense of abuse of psychoactive substances in the age younger than 14. And you can see that 66% of those people did not drink any alcohol or use drugs at that age. And this is also another aspect that proves that this hypothesis about that are quite popular in professional communities as well, that not always they are actually confirmed, supported with facts. Then their survey also covered their situation at the workplace. That also varied, as you can see. So actually, Dobish researchers, they proved that people with different, a variety of backgrounds could become perpetrators. Some of them were very reliable people with good facade. And now when we look at that through the prism of that research, we can see quite a lot of seemingly successful people who turn out to be perpetrators, where there are complaints that they act violently at home. And this survey proves that perpetrators often have quite good impulse control in other contexts about all people around. And they only become violent when they deal with a particular set of persons. And most often these are family members, their wife and children, or elderly parents, or other vulnerable people with whom where the perpetrator dominates in power. And for when dealing with other people, there are no signs of violent behavior. And they have a very good, successful facade. We had a case where the perpetrator would call friends of his wife, asking them, like, can you give me a recipe of a salad? Look, you made such delicious salad. Tell me how to do that. My wife is going to come home and I am going to surprise her. And the wife says that he never brewed tea, even to say nothing about salads. But he did that in order to create this facade, in order to create this picture, this that he is so caring. And she says, if you talk to my friends, to my acquaintances, they adore him. He has a good sense of humor. He is very sociable. He is very much of a gentleman when dealing with other women. Everyone envies me that I have this kind of a husband. I wish they knew what happens. And then when we brought evidence to court, photos, his text messages, photos of her physical lesions, and when they heard their daughter, and the daughter told the jury what had happened. Actually, that facade turned out to be very far from the actual fact. Okay, let's go back to Dobash thing. So many of those perpetrators had temporary part-time jobs or sporadic jobs. Some had criminal records, some did not have, some had a criminal record for non-violent crimes. Actually, their social behavior was very diverse, a very wide range of types of behavior. They originated from various social groups, they had various types of experience, background, different history of relations with law enforcement authorities. So none of these hypotheses that the researchers had at the onset, at the beginning of their survey, none of them turned out to be true. But what was a thing in common for them was the deep beliefs about women. All the perpetrators, all the 105 men who participated in the survey and who were then inmates in prison for murder, all of them were sure that all women use men. All women use men. And when I have such a deep belief, and when I am a man approached by a woman, my psyche, under the impact of this belief, becomes very tense, defensive. I expect being offended or used, humiliated. So my psyche becomes toned up, worry, and then I have to be very attentive. I have to be very cautious, making sure that I am not used. And of course, one psyche cannot be in that situation for a long time because there needs to be some relief. The individual needs to have an opportunity to relax. But if a man has this deep belief that women are a threat, and if they live with women, sooner or later, they implement this fear and act on this fear and this bias, prejudice, and eventually they kill their wives. So this is a key thing, key belief, core belief that we see not only in murderers. So far, we have not worked with murderers, actually. We work with women who suffer violence. And when from time to time we meet perpetrators in court, or not often though, but sometimes they do come to our office, or they start looking for those shelters where their wives may be. So there we witness very much this common deep belief that all women use men. Like, she's not with me for nothing. She cannot be with me for nothing. She wants something from me, sex or money or my apartment or whatever. So I need to be alerted and make sure that I am not used. I have to preemptively control her. I need to have power and control over her so that I am not used. And on the one hand, there are a lot of psychological roots to that core belief. But on the other hand, that's also about gender roots that added wood to the fire, so to say. I mean, socialization, upbringing, maybe there were some factors when they got this deep belief. Somehow it happened that they started believing that all women use men. The second deep belief for them was that women have no range of behavior. Either women are very good or very bad. She is either the perfect princess or the wife, or she is a whore who is going to have contacts, have intercourse with just everyone around. And it's only me who has the capacity to control her. And I must control her and manage her. Because if I loosen a little bit my control, then she will kind of lose herself. And quite often that's what they state in court, like, Judge, Your Excellency, do not separate us. I know how to manage her. She can be a good wife, but she needs to quit from her job because there are a lot of men around who look at her in different ways, and then everything will be fine. So I will manage. So actually, in this communication, the perpetrator demonstrates that they consider, they see these women as sexual objects who have no independent capacity to decide who this person needs to have sexual contact, sexual relations with or not. So the partner is then seen as someone inferior who does not decide for herself, who's going to be used, sexually used as well, by just anyone. And she is incapable of making any decisions about herself and her body. That's important, this deep belief, because not necessarily this deep belief comes before the act of murder. These are deep beliefs that we have everywhere around. And very often, these men become very jealous. They would come to her job out of sudden, and the women say, I don't know what to expect from him. He never tells me the truth about what he's going to do. For example, he tells me I will come at 2 and he comes at 10, or I will do one thing, but he does something different.
And when I get, I see there are some questions in the Q&A. I'll comment on that after the presentation. And the third deep belief about the perpetrators, well, of the perpetrators, about the women, is that women must take care about sexual and everyday needs of men. And that's, you know, their holy belief that
свій
you
обов'язок.
must
Твій
do
обов'язок
your
це,
duty. And
в нас так один
your
колега
duty,
сказав,
well,
я
one
трошки
of the
його
perpetrators
переформулюю,
said that I will
щоб можна
rephrase
було
him
в
a
ефір
little bit,
пускати.
so it
Але
could be
він сказав так: твій
said.
обов'язок,
He says,
щоб
your
завжди було що їсти
duty
вдома,
is to always
щоб завжди
get
було
some
чисто
food at home,
вдома,
to
і
keep the home clean,
щоб
and
ти завжди була готова до
that
сексу,
you
коли я захочу.
need to be
Твоїм
ready
не треба
to
взагалі
have sex whenever
ніхто
I want. So no one cares
не
about
питає,
your
не
needs. No one
цікавить твої потреби.
asks
Якщо я
about
захочу
your
сексу,
needs. If I
ти
want
маєш бути
sex,
готова.
you
Це твій
must be ready to
обов'язок.
that. That's your
Вони
duty.
в такій парадигмі живуть.
And
В нас, наприклад,
they live in this
є
paradigm.
кейс,
We had a case, for
коли
example,
жінка
when
просила
a woman asked
зробити щось, щоб її
to do
швидше
something so that
розлучили,
she could be
тому
divorced
що
faster,
чоловік
because the
кожного
man,
разу, коли їм там відклали, а він затягує,
every
адвокат
time, well,
затягує
where there was a delay,
це
because his
розлучення,
lawyer was
кожного разу він
trying to
відклав,
delay the
не
divorce
розлучили все ще.
process.
Він приходить додому і каже:
He
все, давай.
comes home and says,
І
"Oh, come
вона
on,"
іде на цей
and
сексуальний
she
контакт,
accepts
хоча
this
каже про те,
sexual
що
contact, even
в
though
мене
she
вже
says that
немає сили, я вже
I
не
have
хочу.
no
Якби
strength for that,
і
have no
тому
energy,
є
I'm really
конфлікт
exhausted,
інтересів.
I am disgusted to do
Коли
that.
ми починаємо говорити про те, що
And when we
це
start speaking
зґвалтування
about the
в
fact that
шлюбі,
this is a
ти
rape
маєш
in
право
marriage,
сказати
and
ні.
you have the
Ні
right to say no, you have the right to decline, you must not
до
always be
сексу.
ready to sex.
Досить часто ми, особливо якщо
Quite
це
often,
люди з
especially when
або
these are people from vulnerable populations or people from rural areas, we see that they don't understand this. We have this big problem, actually.
Жінки не
Women
ідентифікують сексуальне
do not identify sexual
сексуальне насильство.
violence in marriage. They're not ready to speak about that. And on the other hand, the men interpret their sexual needs as
обов'язок
a duty
реалізовувати
for
жінка, і вона
the
має
woman.
бути завжди
So she should always be ready to
контактів.
a sexual contact.
Три глибинні переконання
And these three in-depth beliefs,
об'єднання всіх цих кривдників.
they concern 100% of those perpetrators in Dobash's study. And then a similar study was conducted in India by an Indian researcher. I don't remember her name now, but it's in the network and it's in the internet, I mean, and it was about the perpetrators committing sexual violence. So Dobash, a couple, they studied the murderers of wives, and this Indian researcher, she studied the rapists. And the deep beliefs were quite similar in India as well. They concerned the rapists in India. Now we move on.
Так. І наступне,
And the next
дослідження,
study,
на якому би я хотіла
which I would like to speak more about,
дослідження, яке називається
is called Homicide Timeline. It's quite new.
дослідниця Великобританії.
It was conducted by a researcher in the Great Britain who in 2019 studied more than 400 cases of murder, and she found certain trends common for all these cases. And she called it the steps to a murder. So I will speak about them now. The first thing was the experience, a history of harassment and abuse by the perpetrator prior to their relationship. So the perpetrator had already proven to be a perpetrator before. And it needs to be taken into account, especially when we work to prevent such things. You need to talk to young men and women about that. They need to get interested in the prior relationships of their partners. And very often we encounter this comment, oh, he had a trash relationship with that girl, but I will reform him. I will love him and he will change. Maybe, but it is important to know about these things because studies show that that's a risk factor. And this risk factor just needs to be taken into account. And I always wish happiness to the people. I wish them optimism and bright relationships. But I tell my clients, those with whom I work, with the results of the studies that indicate that if there has been a history of harassment and abuse, then that's gonna be a risk factor, a serious one. The next important risk factor is quick dynamics of development of the affair. So it quickly turns into a serious relationship. So this courtship period at the beginning, well, this is a very bright dramatic part. In such relationships, it's very tiny. It's very short. Like you've met, and in a few days or in a few hours, I'm in his apartment already, and haven't even noticed how it happened. So somehow I've moved to his place. Yeah, that's a quote actually from one of my clients. When I started researching her relationship with her partner, and she told me, I was asking her how you got closer, how did you meet, how did you become close, and it was very fast. So this rapid process of closing is a risk factor. It's a signal that there may be some danger. It's not always so, but it is possible. That can be a marker that you need to pay attention to. And then violence starts. And then in the relationship, coercion and control prevail. For example, this client I've mentioned, the one who didn't understand how she moved to his place, she says, I had not yet bought a single clothes that I wanted. Every time he goes to shop with me, and every time I like something, he devalues this. He says that's not something you need and chooses something different. And he persuades me, so there is no physical abuse. But she notices that. She says that when I understood that since the time I moved to his place, I've not got a single thing I really wanted. So he makes decisions about all the things purchased, including personal things that she makes. That's a signal of violence. She says, I don't see violence yet. So if we look at it generally, that's a respectable relationship. Everything looks fine. But when I speak to the girls about first relationships, the first contacts, I always draw their attention to the differences between care and control, because that's a very important marker, in my opinion, that needs to be considered. And quite often the perpetrator tries to present themselves as a custodian, as a ward. And that looks good because it looks tempting, because someone takes care of me, someone makes decisions for me. I don't have to think about whether I need to buy some warm shoes for winter, or maybe I need to take care about something else. Everything just happens. But that's warm water that keeps heated up, and the frog in this warm water will not jump out. It will boil. If it were thrown into this warm water at the beginning, it would jump out. If I had seen who this perpetrator is at the beginning, I would not have started the relationships. But the violence just creeps in. It is step-by-step process. We never link our fate with a person who starts abusing us from the very beginning, who starts being really bad from the start. We usually establish relationships with a caring person, with a person who pays attention to someone who wants us to feel better. And that's a person with whom I open up and become vulnerable. Or we build the relationships. But, well, what's the difference between this custody sort of relationship and care? That's the question which I often ask to the audience, but I will answer that now because we don't have time. Unfortunately, we have only 2 hours for every webinar, and or even less. So we are speaking about very compressed sort of trainings that I conduct here. Usually takes several days, but I present everything in just 2 hours. So custody is always something that goes from up to down. It's always based on the position of power and control. Care is also on the same level. It's also about someone who asks your opinion about what you want to say. I'm sitting in a restaurant drinking beer with my friends, and there my partner calling me, asking me, oh, come on, it's midnight. What do you think? Basically, there are maniacs going around the neighborhood. Yes, come on, it's midnight. I'm taking a car. I go and collect you from there. So the question here is whether that's custody or care. And the answer here depends on the following. That's custody, and for it to become a care, in the end of this question, or this phrase rather, like I'm getting a car and I drive to take you from there should be a question mark. Is it okay for you that I take a car, drive there, and take you back home? Then it's care. So it depends on the question mark. If someone doesn't ask me question about a decision concerning my life or anything, that's not care. So, but if they ask, yes, I say, okay, take me home, or I'll take the taxi, or I say, don't drive here, someone will take me home. So the decision belongs to me. I make the decision. But when I see someone declaring, I'm taking the car and I'm taking you home, then it's not a question to me. That's a decision made for me. I hope you understand this difference because these are very significant points which we often fail to notice when we get into this warm environment of care, or not care, really custody, we regress to become sort of children. We get the same status as children. And sometime later, we encounter violence in our relationship because custody is always about a significant disbalance in power. Okay, so we return to the homicide timeline now. Okay, so something happens in the life when the perpetrator understands that he loses control. So either they stop the relationship, like she says, no, I'm not okay being with you, we will not be together anymore. That's a big risk factor. And there are studies conducted in the USA which indicate that the period of distancing, this period when we get separated, separation period, yes, that, or even threat of separation, increases the risk of being murdered by a factor 10 or even more. So I don't remember the exact numbers, but that's quite shocking numbers. So as soon as the perpetrator understands that he's losing this person, well, he considers her to be his property. He says, you are either mine or no one's. And before the large invasion of the Russians in the COVID period, we had quite noticeable murders, a whole series of femicides when young men murdered the girls when those told them, okay, we'll not be together. One, for example, used some acid to kill her. He sort of rented an apartment and invited her for a goodbye. So, and murdered her there. So we had a series of very specific murders when the relationships were threatened, when the man understood that he was losing the woman, and murdered her because of that factor. Escalation. That's the next fifth step when the perpetrator starts increasing his presence, his control in the life of the perpetrator, of the survivor, and may even threaten suicide. So this suicide thing is the factor that we always work with, and it includes in the form of a risk assessment conducted by the police when the police assesses how high the risk of the repeated violence is. So this suicidal tendency is a serious factor because quite often the perpetrator kills the victim and maybe even children, and then simply commit suicide. So these suicide threats is something that we always encourage to consider seriously. The next one is, the next step in this timeline is the decision. Like, I make a decision that you will not be anyone else's. I'm losing you, and I decide in some way to stop it. And then the seventh step is planning. It is when the perpetrator thinks about the way to commit the murder.
So then planning and then the homicide, murder, implementation of that plan. And here you can see For
презентації слово жертва.
the second time I used the word victim. And there is the question in the chat. So when we speak about victims, we only speak, so we can only apply that word to those who died, who were killed or murdered. So if someone is alive, fighting, where someone has the chance to and certain prospects, we never apply the word victim to him or her. We speak about victims of the war, of traffic, of Holocaust, but we never speak about living people, survivors of domestic violence, as victims, because this word deprives them of any promise, any prospect. It is the word that exhausts this person. And when we work with this category of people, I will speak more about that on Friday. So there, our objective is to give her, to empower her, to give her more resource, more energy, support her in stepping out of that situation and regaining control over her life. That's why we never say victim. And another story that I would like to focus on.
Насильства, тому давайте я зараз повернуся.
And now we are going to describe some situations of violence, so if it may trigger some of you, or if it may re-traumatize you, please take care of yourself, have some water, or I have this exercise activity that I usually teach to almost all of my clients, and that I quite often use myself when I work with survivors. That is points of reliance, or 5 points. Let me now stop sharing so that I could interact with you. So 5 points, or points of reliance. You need to sit down and you need to let your body realize that it has certain points of reliance. The basic position is by sitting, but if it is not possible, for example, if I am waiting to enter the courtroom and I need to stabilize, then I can lean against the wall, and that's going to be 3 points of reliance. So now try to sit down. Please distract from what you are doing. Try to sit down in such a way that your feet are firmly on the floor, and internally with your inner side, sense your right foot contacting the ground or floor or whatever. You can press your right foot against the floor a little bit to sense the contact. So we help the body realize that this is our point of reliance. Same for your left foot. Try to internally observe how your sole, your foot touches the ground, relies on the ground, on the floor. Then we move our focus to our butt. Just observe how the body, legs rely on your butt. First the right side, then the left side. You can balance a little bit while sitting to feel this, to sense this reliance. And then the back. So the right side of the butt, the left side of the butt, and then the back. The next step after you have sensed those is observing your breathing. When you try to start breathing from a lower level, from your stomach, from your belly, this is what signals the body that stress is over, stressful situation is over. And this is like anti-stress agenda for our psyche, where you just observe your breathing. This is a very stabilizing activity. And if you communicate, if you deal with someone who has a lot of intensive emotions, when they come and cry, or where you notice that you are triggered, that you come in contact with your memories, this is where you give your body the signal to jump off this traumatic wall, and where you focus on these 5 points of reliance, you can then ground stabilize, and in that state you can be more helpful for your client, because otherwise you would just cry together. So please try and use this activity, this exercise. We use it when we prepare the survivor for court hearings, especially if they survived sexual violence and are going to face the perpetrators, the rapists. And this is something that helps stabilize well enough. It helps me when I work with this kind of a person, and also to the client. And actually, when I use that, my clients may not even notice that that's what I'm doing, that I'm trying to stabilize myself, because they share some stories. I may disconnect for a while and then reconnect and be more efficient than before. So when we speak, when we describe certain cases of violence, at this point, it is important to be stable. And now I would proceed with description of violence. Before I read the story, I will tell you what preceded it. This is the approach that we are supposed to use when we speak about violence. Because here, many of us are people who communicate, who deal with various vulnerable categories of women, and we may often share stories in social media or when meeting journalists. So this approach is very good, and it indicates what we need to emphasize. This was developed by Linda Cox, that is a Swedish journalist and expert. She applied it where she just took a newspaper article that is a description of a criminal case, criminal chronicles, and this is a description of an act of rape. This is a very brief article describing the rape. He followed her down the sidewalk. She jumped back. He jumped up to catch her. She moved to the other side. He grabbed her shoulders and threw her to the ground. She rolled on the ground trying to free herself. He dragged her towards shrubs. She clung to roots of trees so that he could not pull her into the shrubs. She started screaming. He held a rock over her head and threatened to kill her if she screamed. She stopped screaming. He called her abusive names. She said, "You don't want to do this. You don't want to hurt me." He forced her to turn towards him. She turned her face away. He tried to take off her belt. She bulged her belly so that he couldn't remove the belt. He threw her to the ground to hold her with his whole body. She crossed her legs so that He could not remove her pants. He overpowered her and raped her vaginally. She was frightened, and to avoid further traumatization, she got up and went somewhere else. So that's an article that was published in a newspaper. And Linda gave us this article and asked us to cross out everything about her behavior. Every sentence that describes her behavior needs to be crossed out. And that's what we did. You can see how we did it. And then we have this story. He followed her down the sidewalk. He jumped up to catch her. He grabbed her shoulders and threw her to the ground. He dragged her towards shrubs. She started, so he held the rock over her head and threatened to kill her if she screamed. He called her abusive names. He forced her to turn towards him. He tried to take off her belt. He threw her to the ground to hold her with his whole body. He overpowered her and raped her vaginally. That's the result that we got by crossing out all the mentions of what the survivor did. And this approach is used by Linda. So when I hold trainings for journalists, we discuss that a lot. And I motivate them, I invite them to see acts of violence through this perspective. Now, why? Because when we start describing behavior of the survivor, what does our psyche do? When I read this text, my psyche wants me to be safe. And the first thing that my psyche does is identifying me with the survivor. And then I start analyzing, what did she do wrong? I mean, what did she fail to do to avoid this rape? Well, maybe she did not bulge her belly enough. Maybe she did not beg him enough. Maybe she was walking too slowly, and so on and so forth. So that's a trap where the psyche finds itself. All of us tend to do that because we then take the position of victim blaming, because then we try to look for the reasons why that happened. And we try to look for some reasons how the survivor was to be blamed. So then we are caught in this trap of our psyche in order, that happens as defense, where we defend ourselves. We had an interesting litigation case that was quite a terrible situation of violence, and the judge, quite reasonable woman, quite attentive. She was listening to the perpetrator quite attentively. She did not make any inappropriate comments based on gender stereotypes or whatever. But eventually she would ask the survivor, tell me, why did he do this to you? I mean, that was a question from the judge to the survivor. And the survivor said, well, here is the guy, ask him. So what the psyche of the judge did? The woman was more or less the same age as the survivor, so she quickly identified herself with the survivor. And in order to kind of unconsciously make this experience a distance from herself, to defend herself from this experience, she asked that question each time when we want to ask the question, why does he do that to you? Why does he offend, attack you? You need to keep in mind that this question must go not to the survivor, but to the perpetrator. And we had quite a lot of highly covered episodes, situations of rape in Ukraine, where journalists would try and explore. For example, there was a case where there was a rape in a police department, where policemen raped someone. And we had terrible journalists' investigations where they tried to explore the victim's childhood, who she was friends with, who she dated, but nobody explored childhood of the perpetrators. I mean, perpetrators usually remain in the shadow. The main issue of this social context of violence, I believe, is that nobody takes into account behavior of the perpetrator. When we speak about any coverage of rape or other GBV case, we hear that she was from a vulnerable family, distressed family. She was unemployed, or the other way around, she was very successful. So we try to describe the circumstances of the survivor while the perpetrator always remains in the shadow. So I believe that a very important focus for our activism needs to be highlighting the perpetrator, focusing on the perpetrator, what he did, how he found himself in that situation, how the society promoted this pattern of behavior, how the state made it possible for that to happen. And then we will have quality journalism investigations, and our comments, our interviews would then be much more sensitive to issues of violence and issues of survivors. And just a couple of comments about what we should say, what we should not say. I mentioned already that we do not speak of those people as victims. Unfortunately, well, this is international trend that started quite recently. And unfortunately, some international documents still contain the word victim. The Ukrainian legislation no longer includes the word victim in any of the documents, but in the Istanbul Convention, it is quite widely used, because we know that the Istanbul Convention was developed quite a long time ago, and back then there was still no initiative to stop using the word victim, so take that into account. And we do not speak about was subject to violence. It needs to be about the active possession of the perpetrator, that he committed violence. It's not that she kind of yielded to violence or she provoked violence. So we do not speak about provoking violence. And here I'm going to wrap up. Let me proceed with then your questions, trying to comment on your questions. And there was a question about whether there is a research on the victimity of survivors of GBV, and why, when a woman separates with a perpetrator, after a while, when she starts a new relationship, the same pattern is often repeated. This is a question in the Q&A section, and let me try and respond. So speaking about provoking and committee. So during today's webinar, I try to make sure that we have a good understanding of that. It is that perpetrator who is responsible for violence, and no matter how a young child behaves, anyway, the decision and the liability for violence in that relationship is on the perpetrator. Same applies here.
And whatever I do, we can experiment actually. Provoke me to hit you or to commit violence. No, it won't happen. If I don't want to be violent, whatever you do, I will not do that. Now, talking about victimity, that's the term which was removed from the Ukrainian legislation because the first domestic violence law it was on it was called on the violence in the family, and in its first edition, it included the liability even for victim behavior. And after a lot of appeals from human rights organizations and activists to Ukraine cancelled this term, this concept of victim behavior and provoking the violence, and especially then punishment of the survivor of violence. It's no more our practice, and these things do not apply to Ukraine, at least in legislation anymore. Now, talking about the fact that a woman living the perpetrator then starts a new relationship and her new partner also is violent. Well, the answer can be different because, first of all, we have a lot of perpetrators, and she could just be unlucky and she encountered another perpetrator who, well, commits violence too. Second, again, in this we return to the very same paradigm. If the perpetrator, it's the second new perpetrator, commits violence, it doesn't mean that she somehow needs to suffer. No one can perform violence against another person, and whatever state does, it must intervene and protect this person. There are studies that sort of explain. Unfortunately, I don't speak a lot on psychological theories and approaches at these webinars. However, there are studies looking into victimity, and they show that there are several percent of such victim behavior which are aimed at faster resolution of this phase of growing tension. And when this growing tension is very high, the affected woman cannot do anything to do that. She may provoke the violence to make it happen faster because she is not just cannot wait anymore, because she suffers because of it even more. But it's just a few percent, and it cannot be something to normalize the violence. We must understand whatever happens, the maniac has, whatever happens in the victim's behavior, the perpetrator can always get distanced and perform no violence. Yeah, I also had to, sorry, I forgot that I had to speak about the correctional programs. Okay, so a few more words. I don't hear you, Victoria. A few more words about the correction programs. We have a few more minutes, so I'll be brief. The correction programs for perpetrators. First of all, the Istanbul Convention mandates that the state creates the opportunities for perpetrators to get aid and correct their behaviors. And here it is important to understand. Well, I'm giving here only my opinion. These are conclusions that I make personally, considering certain experiences I've had. I am sure that for a special correctional program for perpetrators to correct their behaviors, for it to be successful, we need to make the perpetrators come for it voluntarily. Occasionally, I encounter such situations when, for example, the survivor says that she started changing her behaviors, and the perpetrator says, I would like also to go to the psychologist. Maybe you could ask her, maybe she would be working with me. I don't work with the perpetrators, I only work with the women who abuse their children. That's a different thing, and I can then refer this person to my colleagues. And such situations are much more effective than when the perpetrator is sent to the program by court. So in Ukraine, it is possible that a court makes the perpetrator take a program for perpetrators. And for failure to go to this program, the perpetrator will be liable. There will be criminal liability, actually. So if he is referred to this program and he avoids taking it, he will be criminally liable. And I think that's a sort of a simulacrum. Because, for example, when perpetrators come to this program, they must do that because they will be criminally liable, and then they start behaving like, oh, come on, now let's do your trick. And those poor psychologists that need to do that quite often, they face a very strong resistance, because when the person doesn't want to change his behavior, then it is very difficult to create this desire to change. And here I would like also to note about the motivation, because unfortunately the correctional programs I have seen, because all the local authorities that we have, the local self-government authorities, they cannot adopt their programs based on a large program. They have very small or no motivational part, no motivational component. So for a correction program to be effective, what I would do, I would increase significantly the incentives, the motivation, the time that we spend explaining how the violence affects the perpetrator and the person he loves, his relatives, family, job, whatever. So if the perpetrator then understands that this violence destroys himself too, then he will be much more willing to cooperate with the people who perform the correction work. And it is important that this correctional program has both group
зустрічі, так і
sessions
індивідуальну
and individual meetings,
терапію. З того,
individual
що я бачила
therapy.
в різних країнах,
And from what I have
дуже
seen in
ефективно
various countries,
застосовується КПТ в
uh,
корекційних програмах.
correctional
Це
behavioral
в
therapy
Україні,
is very
наприклад, в
effective.
Хорватії
For example, in Croatia, they
використовується
have it and it works quite well.
програми на основі
They
КПТ.
have
Те саме в Канаді,
CBT-based
інших
programs
країнах
in Canada too,
там
in
є
some other
чіткі
countries as
протоколи,
well. So they have clear protocols
вони
that they
в
follow.
індивідуальною
They
дійсністю,
work with
з
anger.
підвищенням імпульсної
They work with strengthening the impulse control.
Там різних
So there are many things like mindfulness
І
practices and
наступне,
so
що я
on.
хотіла ще
The
додати,
next
що
thing that I
з
would like
моєї
to
точки
add,
зору, і я погоджуюся, я
and I
мала
agree actually,
обговорення цих корекційних
I
програм
had a
з
discussion of these correctional
випускником
programs with one expert from the
вона
USA.
знаходиться в
She's
університеті,
a researcher
і вона
at the
сказала також, що
university, and she said that their
якщо
studies
програма
show
не
that if the
несе
program
цього такого глибинного
does not
розуміння, як
bring
відбувається
this deep
як
understanding of how this perpetrator is genderized,
насильство було йому
how the violence was
передано цим соціумом,
delegated to him by the society,
програма не буде
then the
ефективна.
program will not be effective.
Частина
And that is why
гендерних
part
стереотипів,
of these gender stereotypes,
оцих практик
part of these
соціальних
practices,
практик
social
гендерування,
practices of
мають бути
genderizing
значно
must be
в
significant
програмах.
in the
Зараз
correctional
це
programs.
все,
So
що
now,
я
finally, that's
планувала
all that I had planned to say. I have said
представити
it.
вам сьогодні. І
I have
тут ще
presented
було
that.
питання про
And
глибинне
there was
переконання.
also a question about the deep belief.
Дуже, ну, там різні напрямки дуже добре працюють
Various
з глибинними переконаннями, в тому числі
the fields, various directions of work, they work with deep beliefs such as CBT. For example, it helps changing the deep beliefs that are root causes of our behaviors. That's an individual
Пані
therapy.
Марта, від нас все.
So that's it, I think. And if you don't have anything to add, any remarks or questions, yeah, see you on Friday.
До зустрічі в п'ятницю.
Thanks.
Дякую, до зустрічі.